I was just playing Lego. Just kidding. I stopped playing Lego a long time ago. But I brought some Lego here today to remind you about the building blocks analogy. Today we are discussing the inventory analysis stage of the life cycle assessment, and specifically the data. We will talk about when we need to collect the data ourselves and when we can use generic databases. Do you remember that unit processes are our building blocks in LCA? You should also remember that the data attached to these unit processes consists of material flows, inputs and outputs. We need lots of these blocks if we want to build an inventory of the entire life cycle of our product or product system. You may be wondering how an LCA practitioner manages to collect all the necessary data. Bear in mind that we could be talking about hundreds, possibly thousands of unit processes. Collecting all the data would take a huge amount of time. It is also possible that we aren't able to find the data that we are looking for, like this invisible unit process over here, you see that? Or even a large part of our assessment. See that? Big gap in the data. Fortunately, for some of these problems, generic inventory databases exist. Generic databases can help us fill in the gaps and save time on collecting data. They can be compared to existing pieces of the puzzle that were put together before and can easily be applied in building up our inventory, just like when you were a kid and used parts of the old structure to make a new structure. It is important to be aware that you cannot always use generic unit processes from databases because in some cases, generic data may not adequately and accurately reflect important unit processes which are unique to your product. For these unique processes, you will need to collect the data yourself. When talking about data collection, we can make a distinction between primary data and secondary data. Primary data you collect yourself, either through interviews, questionnaires, or by actually physically measuring the flows and quantities of resources, emissions, and products. Secondary data was collected by someone else before you. This can be from a prior LCA study or from a database. In LCA terminology, we refer to primary data as foreground data and secondary data as background data. Foreground data is the data or unit processes that are specific to the product we are evaluating, which you collect yourself. Background data is what we typically find in generic databases. They include unit processes that more or less represent what is used by an industry on average. If you require specific unit process data that differs from the unit processes in databases or previous LCA studies, then you need to collect the data. You need foreground data. You should bear in mind that there is no sharply defined rule for when unit process data should be from background data or foreground data. But there are some very general guidelines that I will touch upon. Let's go back to our product system flow diagram for plastic bread packaging. We start with our reference process, or packaging of bread. This is quite a specific process of putting bread into a certain type of bag, which is made of polyethylene. There are possibly studies which have data on bread packaging machines, assuming this is an industrial process and not your friendly baker who packs the bread by hand. Can we use this data? Well, if we happen to have data specific to the actual machine, then it is best to use that. If we don't have this data, we should try to collect it. Then we'll have to use the available generic or background data. We can use background data for processes which are further back from the reference process, and for which there are no strictly unique processes. So for example, if the transport processes don't require specially equipped trucks, then it is satisfactory to use generic process data. A range of databases exist, some of which are open access and some of which you need to pay for. Certain software packages also come with licenses to databases. When collecting the data ourselves, it is important to ensure the quality of the data. Data collecting can be very time-consuming and frustrating, but it is a very important part of LCA. The strength of our model is largely dependent on the quality of the inputs, or as some practitioners say, garbage in, garbage out. As a practitioner working on new circular products, you will quickly realize that the data you need is not always in databases. Making decisions regarding assumptions and using comparable data to the data you really need is a tricky part of LCA. What helps is to remember LCA is an iterative process. So when you're stuck, make a note of your assumptions. These parts of the LCA can be improved in future iterations. You can always improve the model in later iterations. See you next time.